We're here with Gene Heilman today to talk about our involvement with the Conference Disaster Response Program. This particularly seems like a good time to do it because it's the beginning of hurricane season. We always think of that as a disaster response time. So, Gene, first let's start off in what's your position with the program?
I'm the Rio, Texas Conference Disaster Response Coordinator. Every conference, as per the discipline, the bishop appoints a coordinator, and that's the role that I play here.
So you're the top man for this now.
I'm not sure that is very descriptive, but
well, good. So, and I understand we've got a couple of other people involved with positions on that program.
St. Matthew's probably has more involvement than any other church in the conference in terms of leadership, especially. Larry Etter has been involved in leadership for a long time. Right now he's serving as the logistics coordinator, so he's responsible for all of our equipment and that type of thing, repairs and keeping track of it and moving it around and so on. Then Les Barrow is the district coordinator. In addition to the conference coordinator, every district has a district coordinator, and Les plays that role for Los Misiones district.
Okay. How did you start with the program? You mentioned since the beginning. How did we at St. Matthew's get involved with it?
Yeah, my involvement in disaster response probably goes back to our work during Katrina.
Yes.
If you recall, the church adopted a apartment complex. Al Cargan was the kingpin in all of that, and I got involved in that. And as I looked around, it looked to me like the United Methodist Church wasn't involved very much in Katrina, and so I was interested in getting involved and getting the church involved. It turns out, by the way, that they were much more involved than I knew they were, but nonetheless, that still sort of pushed me in. And so I took the first ERT class that was offered in Texas. ERT is Early Response Team Training, and these are the groups that go out. They help clean up more than anything else, but they do a number of things. So I took the first one of those was offered in Texas, was actually in Texas Conference at Woodlands, and then we offered one here in San Antonio, or UMCOR actually does that training, and so I went to that. But there were a lot of other people involved in that class. In fact, St. Matthew's had about half the people in that particular class. So that got me started, and we actually deployed. The St. Matthew's team was the first team to deploy ERT teams. This was a new UMCOR program, and we went to Eagle Pass after the tornado out there, and that was the first time that an ERT class had been deployed in the what was then Southwest Texas Conference. But we've been involved ever since. Then leadership position came open, and I was appointed the disaster response coordinator for the conference.
Oh, okay. Now, you've mentioned Eagle Pass and you've mentioned Dehennis, so it's not just hurricanes that you guys get involved with. It's what types of other disasters?
In fact, hurricanes we talk a lot about hurricanes, but in fact we don't. Harvey was big, but in fact every year we have multiple disasters of various types, and in fact just recently there was a hurricane went up through Florida and dumped a lot of rain on there and did that. Well, in Texas, without any hurricane, we had more rain than the hurricane put on Florida. And as a consequence, we had flooding in the valley and flooding in Rockport. And we tried to respond to both of those floods. I mentioned Dehennis. We've been trying to do a lot of work there. They had a hailstorm in Dehennis that smashed literally every unprotected window on the north side of every building in town.
Wow.
I mean, there were these big hailstorms, and obviously the wind was coming out of the north, and it smashed them. You could imagine what it did to all the roofs in town, mobile homes, in those ones that had the wooden siding. A lot of that was just smashed off. The metal was all dinged up. Cars that were unprotected were smashed. But it was a small disaster. It didn't affect a very big area. And a lot of times those are the hardest disasters to deal with because nobody wants to get involved in them. And so we're involved in that pretty much by ourselves. I'm talking about by ourselves, the Rio, Texas Conference. And so that's an important type of disaster. We go out and respond, but then in addition to that, we have to deal with what we refer to as the recovery phase of the disaster, when we go in and try to repair things. The ERT teams try to keep more damage from being done, so they'll put tarps on roofs or put a board over the window in the case of D'Hanis, and if it's a flood, they'll go in and clean out the muck and the mess and cut off the drywall to keep more damage from being done.
Okay.
But the recovery phase is and we often refer to it as long-term recovery because it takes a lot longer. That's where we go in and try to fix things, rebuild, and so on. In Hurricane what was the big one? Harvey.
Harvey, yes, Harvey.
How soon we forget? Our total budget there was around $13 to $14 million.
Wow.
Well, almost all of that was in the recovery phase. We built multiple new homes and all that type of thing. And right now in the valley, we're dealing with, as of last week, 4 different disasters. Each of the last 4 years was a disaster in there. Well, we went in and tried to do response work and get some cleanup. We often take flood buckets in, and that's helpful, although we need to send people in as well. But for the 3 years prior to that, we're still working on recovery work to try to fix homes that were damaged. And so recovery is an important part of what we do, but it's a little different than the response
I see.
work.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned, Port Aransas after Harvey. I happened to be down there a week or two after the storm hit, and if you've never seen a disaster area up close and personal like that, it's amazing it's awesome how much damage there is, and it's really saddening in a heartfelt way.
Yeah, it is.
Well,
and I think we often talk about going in and seeing people on the worst day of their life. After their home has just literally been smashed apart or flooded. I just can't imagine my home being flooded, and it's just so devastating the loss that you encounter.
So, what do you do with these people? Is there any way you try to comfort them or help them, or is it just a physical help, how does our efforts affect these people?
The mission of disaster response is to be a caring Christian presence in the aftermath of disaster.
Okay.
And so we do stuff, yes, and that's not unimportant that we do stuff, but the most important thing we do is we are a caring Christian presence, and that can involve listening. In the ERT training, for example, we always talk a lot about how important it is to listen, because people have to tell their story in order to recover from this as part of it, and so it's so important to listen to what they have to say. Now we're not spiritual trained, counselors, but you can still listen, and that's so important to helping them recover.
Yeah. I did not realize there was that kind of training with the disaster response. I just had assumed it was how to be a carpenter, how to clean up, and that kind of thing. So that's good to know that
Yeah.
that's being done
The,
too.
the
Yeah.
ER training is a full day, and we encourage people to do it. I mean, we have a lot of people in the church that are trained, but the lifespan of an ERT person is fairly short because most of us are pretty old when we get trained, and so by the time we do it a few years, it's time to hang up the boots.
Yeah.
But that class talks about the what I call disaster 101. It's sort of the language of disaster.
Oh, okay.
How do we go about it? Who else is involved in disaster? What does UMCOR do in disaster? They're very important. And then it talks a lot about safety, because there's a lot of ways to get hurt, and as you could imagine when you're out there. And then we talk also about, okay, how do you do things? How is the proper way to put a tarp on a roof? If you had a flood, what's the proper way to cut off the drywall? What do you do? How high? All those kinds of things. So that's sort of the different aspects of that training.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, along with you talking and listening to the people that have been experiencing this devastation, how has the experience, and you've seen in people, and I don't particularly want any particular names, how does it affect the people that have gotten involved and that are helping, or maybe you personally? How does that affect the people? Is there anything you can tell us about that?
I'm not sure I can tell you a whole lot, but I do know that any time you're involved in ministry, there are two sides of that. One is you're helping somebody, and that's clearly the reason you're doing it. But there's also the fact that it impacts you, and it would be hard to imagine being very effective in ministry of any kind. Disaster ministry is the one that I'm in, without it having an effect on you. And
this disaster relief training and the teams, as I understand it, and my wife, as you mentioned, having done it, that takes sometimes days at a time to get involved with. What if somebody doesn't have that much time? What else could they do to help with your programs? What kind of periphery or support type functions are there?
Well, one of the ones that we've been involved in recently, and it's not always available, is verifying flood buckets, cleaning kits. When the various groups do kits, they don't always get them quite right. And so before UMCOR will send a kit out with their name on it, they insist that every one of those kits is examined to make sure, A, that everything in there is right, and B, that nothing has happened since it was made. One of the big problems we've had is dampness. There were pre-moistened sponges were put in a lot of kits. Well, some of the kits are around for several years before they're actually used. I mean, there's an inventory, and you have to have that. So when the disaster strikes, you're ready to go.
Sure.
Well, then people will make them, and they'll go into inventory. And so sometimes we've had to throw almost whole kits because they had something in there wrong. It caused mildew for the gloves. There's gloves in there, and a lot of fabric and that type of thing.
Unintended consequences.
Right. Yeah. And so everything has to be verified.
Okay.
Of course, people can always give money. There's a disaster response fund at the conference level, and then St. Matthew's has been very responsive to UMCOR Day, and we need to appreciate ourselves as a church for that response. I believe this past year we gave more than any other church in the conference.
Wow.
And that is, I've checked that before, and that's not the only time that has happened.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very important. A lot of the money we get at the conference level, it comes from UMCOR.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so important
Okay.
to have that support.
And UMCOR is the United Methodist.
United Methodist Committee on Relief.
Okay.
And they have many international programs as
Okay.
well as the national
Mhm.
domestic relief program.
Okay.
They're also involved in the immigration
Oh,
work,
okay.
and so they're involved in a lot of places, but
Mhm.
they're extremely important to the disaster response
Mhm.
effort. Uh, then just prayer support is another
Yeah.
way that,
Mhm.
that you can be involved. Many disaster early response teams only deploy for one day at a time. They don't go far away.
Mhm.
Some do, but even if you can't be gone for 3 or 4 days, you could be still involved in early response. And I
okay.
would encourage
Okay.
people to go ahead and take the training
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and be involved a little closer to home. 3 days is the maximum that an ERT team is allowed to deploy without taking a day off.
I see.
And if you've ever been on one, you know why that is.
I can imagine.
Because it is very tiring work. And often you're sleeping on an air mattress or not sleeping on an air mattress. And so 3 days is enough.
Yeah. Wow. I can see that. How would you like to see this program grow, or what other needs do you have with it? There are things that you could see that might branch out into that it's not doing. Is there anything else, or do you
I
think
don't know
it's
that there's so
doing
much
pretty
we
well?
need to branch into. What we need to do is get better response for the work that we're doing.
Mm.
We have hundreds of people trained, but when the call goes out and says we need help, we don't get the kind of response that we wish we would get. And we know it's hard to get away, but there are people out there hurting.
Yeah.
I've lately been thinking a lot about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and there's an awful lot of times when we walk by on the other side and aren't able to respond. We always have good reasons, and it made me think that the priest and the Levite, they probably felt bad about having to walk by that guy. We tend to think of them as being cold and not, just don't care. No, they probably cared a lot, but they just had other things that they had to do. And I think we do that in disaster response.
Okay.
And so.
That's an interesting take. I hadn't thought of that before. Yeah. You told me earlier an interesting story of your first disaster response trip that you made and what your focus was on. And would you mind repeating that?
Short memory. Which you're talking about the.
Well, you were saying you went one and you all were focused on building things.
Oh, yeah. Well, after Katrina, and then there was another hurricane that came in right after that.
Right.
Hit up in through East Texas, and so we decided, a group from St. Matthew's decided we were going to go and help those folks. And so we got our hammers and our tools ready, and we were ready to go fix stuff. And so we called them, and they said, well, we really need people to pick up brush and stuff. No, we're ready to build. We're ready to build stuff. And so finally they relented and said, okay, come on. And this was in East Texas. So what they did is they sent us to Orange, and we built a ramp. Now it needed done, but it had nothing to do with the hurricane. And
That was a handicap ramp, wasn't it? for someone?
Yeah. And so that, now that I'm on the other side, I see these people saying to me, and I say, no. But it's important that when we do mission, that we do what's needed and don't make the decision ourselves what is needed, reach out and find out what is needed.
The importance of the disaster training too, so they
Right,
can learn
yeah.
what's right. Yeah.
In fact, one of the other parts of the disaster training is that we tell people you do not respond to a disaster without an invitation. There's a tendency, there's a big bunch of people, when they hear about a disaster, they hop in the car and they go. And that is not effective response. That's why it's important to be trained, it's important to be a part of a group,
Yeah.
and it's important to have a contact before you get there so that they know you're coming, they know how to put you to work, and that's
That makes
very
sense.
important.
Yeah. Okay. Gene, that I think covers it really well. If somebody wanted to get involved here at St. Matthew's, what do they do? Do they contact you, or is there some other
I
way
would
to do
suggest
it?
contacting Les. He's a district coordinator.
That's right.
And,
You don't want to overstep his
no, they want to
bounds,
step
do
on
you?
his toes. But he's the district coordinator,
Okay.
and he could help you get involved.
Okay. Well, this has really been impressive. I had no idea, even though I've been somewhat involved from the sidelines, that the program was like this. Gene, we really admire you for your involvement and enthusiasm about it and the way you've taken charge of it. And apparently the conference is too. So we thank you a lot for
Thank
that.
you very much.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate the work you've done.